Welcome to this episode of the Sports Detective Podcast Show. My name is James Williams, and today we are talking about the Cincinnati Bengals, and I am joined by John Sheeran, who is an editor-writer who covers the Bengals for A to Z Sports. And John, I wanted to start off here because the Bengals decided to do an interesting team-building strategy. They said, hey, we're going all in paying our franchise quarterback. We're going all in paying our superstar wide receiver, and we're also going all in paying T. Higgins a whole bunch of money. And the thing is, like, hey, we're spending all this money on these guys, but there's still a lot of holes on this football team. Can you convince me why that is a smart football building strategy and why Bengals fans should believe that it is a good strategy to get back to the Super Bowl?
So I would say that, first of all, thank you for having me on. I would say that this kind of goes back a couple of years when this team went to the Super Bowl, went back to an AFC Championship game. They were about to pay Burrow. They were starting the conversation about paying Higgins. They knew that they were going to pay Chase, and obviously they knew they were going to pay Burrow. And at the time, you started to realize that, okay, this team is entering in a familiar territory where back in the Carson Palmer days, they paid him, they paid Chad Johnson, TJ Houshmandzadeh, Andy Dalton. They paid Andy Dalton, AJ Green, and some other pieces, and they couldn't necessarily sustain a decent level of talent to get back to like whether it be the playoffs or in this case the Super Bowl. Right? They've always run into these issues when they enter the second contracts for quarterbacks and they can't sustain that talent, whether it be their drafts go poorly or in this case, like their free agent decisions went poorly. So back then, I think there was a definite conversation about letting T. Higgins go, still pay Jamar Chase, because once you have Jamar Chase, you need to pay Jamar Chase. But better distributing some resources to either defense or the offensive line instead of paying your other wide receiver. And what happened in the next couple of off seasons is, again, they whiffed a ton in free agency. They've been whiffing in the draft recently, albeit like the past couple ones have been a little bit better. But they got to the point where their whole roster was basically drained of talent because players either got old or their other contingencies replacing these players just weren't hitting. So at a certain point, like T. Higgins is your third, fourth, fifth, at the very least, fifth best player on your team. And you have a lot of not only cap space, you have a lot of cash on hand to pay him as well. And paying T. Higgins is not necessarily stopping them from paying a guy like Trey Hendrickson, or it wasn't stopping them from, signing a guard in free agency as well. So they've had the ability to build a contending team while on top of paying with T. Higgins, because quite frankly, James, there was no one else on the roster worth paying aside from Trey Hendrickson. So what they landed on is that, hey, like, we have a great thing going here. We have great chemistry with Burrow, Chase, and Higgins. They're all locked in. They're all best buds, and they obviously win together when they're all on the football field. And obviously with T, he's been injured quite a bit, so that hasn't always been the case in terms of him being on the field. But in terms of just what their decisions were with where the roster was at, I fully supported them paying both of these guys because, again, like, it wasn't necessarily stopping them from getting the team better in some areas because they still had the cash and the cap space to do that. But yeah, like back then a couple of years ago when they could have made better decisions, like maybe, I don't know, paying Jesse Bates, right? Don't letting him walk out the door, right? There are other decisions for where to spend that money, but because they didn't make those decisions, or some of those decisions just went down south, I totally understand paying T. Higgins, and I don't think it prevented them from getting the team to a better spot than, frankly, where it is now.
Well, it's doubling down on his strength. It is, hey, we are going to have the best 1-2 wide receiver combo in the NFL, or if not, top 2 or 3. Maybe you want to throw the Eagles guys in there, but it's just doubling down on his strength. And we'll just do this better than you guys. And we'll bank that we can, rebuild the defense through the NFL draft with smart free agent signings, with coaching. So I also agree with you. Like, and also another point too, is you're not overpaying any of these guys.
Right.
Like Jamar Chase is the best wide receiver in the NFL. Joe Burrow is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. T. Higgins would have gotten that money from any other team, maybe even a little bit more if you were to have traded him for a first round pick or whatever kind of picks package you could have gotten from him. So, and also too, if you were to trade, let's say T. Higgins for like 3 draft picks, wherever they be, probably the likelihood is you're not going to be getting a player that's better than T. Higgins with any of those picks. So even though it's kind of scary, just looking at the price tag of all of it, and it does, make flexibility a little bit harder. I do, I'm fine with the decision, and I still think this team's capable of getting back to the Super Bowl. Zach Taylor entering his 7th season, he has a 46-52-1 record. His 3rd season takes the Bengals to the Super Bowl. The next year, They are a few plays away from making it back to the Super Bowl. The last 2 years haven't been in the playoffs at all, missing out on the playoffs. We know 2023, Joe Burrow was hurt. Is it just me, or should he be on the hot seat? Because right now it feels like heading into the season, he's not.
Yeah, I mean, this is the Bengals, right? They kept on Marvin Lewis for damn near my entire life at that time. So it's not about like accepting mediocrity. I think it's about this front office wants to give a coach like as many chances as possible. And sometimes, obviously, if you have like Bruce Coslet or Dick LeBeau at the time, like you can't hold them on for too long. But I think Zach has gotten to a point where they trust his process, and 95% of the time, I think he does the right thing. I think a lot of people look, and I think the biggest point of criticism for him, situational play calling. But unfortunately, that's a problem for the vast majority of head coaches and play callers in the NFL. So it's not like even that glaring of an issue. But I think with this year with Zach, it's almost like, okay, you got rid of Lou and a remote. You got rid of the offensive line coach, Frank Pollock, who just wasn't a mesh with the team as well. You made these big decisions to turn over a decent amount of his coaching staff. And at a certain point, you're right, it does fall on the head coach to replace those guys with competent coaches as well and get this thing back in the right track, because you can only miss the playoffs with Joe Burrow so many times before the arrow is definitively pointed at you. The reason why I don't think he's actually on the hot seat this year is because I don't think that they would hire a new defensive coordinator, who, by the way, is next door neighbors with Zach Taylor. Al Golden never left Cincinnati despite being hired by Notre Dame. He still kept his house in Cincinnati, and his family lived down here, and they kept in touch throughout those couple of years that he was away, obviously for work. So when they fired Anarumo, or when they were in the process of doing that, Al Golden was always number one on his list. So I think that they would make this decision to bring in someone that obviously is intimately familiar with Taylor, having coached here for a couple of years when he was the linebackers coach. I think that this is going to be a 2-year thing. I don't know if they're going to be willing to blow this whole thing up this year unless something completely drastic happens. Like if they start 0-11 or something like that, which I don't think anyone really expects with the talent on this team that exists. But if something does tragically happen like that and it's firmly on coaching decisions, then at that point you don't really have a choice. But I don't think the Bengals are as bad to bottom out like that. And I think no matter what happens realistically this year, Taylor is going to see 2027. But if nothing happens by then you have 2 years with these new coaches. His contract is going to be expiring at the end of 26 too, and that's another thing. The Bengals don't like to pay coaches who aren't here. So 2 years left on his deal, 2 years with this defensive coordinator, this new coaching staff. See what you can do, and if you don't do anything beyond that, then I think it's time to look for a new head coach for sure.
Well, I think the thing is too, he's had a lot of success. And it seems like he actually, when he has a good team, when everyone's healthy, the team can actually go really, really far. And, I think a lot of the AFC was very lucky, and maybe not lucky is the right word, but they took like a big sigh of relief when the Bengals slightly missed out on the playoffs last year, because even though the team was very flawed with, the wide receivers with Joe Burrow, they can get hot and they can beat anyone on any given Sunday. So I think I'm okay with that too. The record too that I pointed out, like the first 2 years was the year before they got Joe Burrow, and then the first year Joe Burrow tears his ACL. So that's kind of why the record is what it is. The last 4 years have been, I believe he's above 500 each of the last 4 seasons. So Joe Burrow's career so far, we have had every single offseason except for this one has just been very unique for Joe Burrow. Obviously had the COVID thing the very first year. The next year he's recovering from an ACL. He's recovering from I believe it was like a calf or a hamstring one offseason too. He injured. Last year, obviously, he was dealing with the wrist, and that limited him a lot in practice. Just having him completely healthy this year or this offseason, that has to be just, monumental for this team getting off to a hot start in the regular season, because, in the Joe Burrow, Zach Taylor era, that hasn't been something that the Bengals have been, known to do, is getting off to really hot starts. They usually kind of start off slow and then, finish hot at the end of the year, like they finished the season last year, winning 5 games in a row.
Yeah, I mean, they've only won one week 1 game since Zach has been hired, and it was an overtime. It was kind of lucky against the Minnesota Vikings. They've never won a week 2 game. So yeah, like when you deal with the Chiefs and Pat Mahomes and the Bills and Josh Allen, just finding yourself in that hole just immediately, it never does you any favors. And it's gotten to the point where like the Bengals always have to play catch up in October and November and December, and luckily at that point, my biggest thing with Burrow is I think you're right in the terms of it's been the biggest factor as to why they haven't been playing well, because he's always had to play catch up in the offseason and right before the season, but also because he hasn't really played in the preseason and he has to just kind of do this trial by fire thing in September. You don't see really the full version of him. The difference is in the first 2 weeks compared to the final 15 weeks of the season, basically for his entire career, it's night and day. And that's why when November and December comes around, he looks like the full version of himself. He's making plays in and out of the pocket. Obviously, his accuracy is amongst the best in the NFL, and he plays like an MVP caliber quarterback. And if you were to get that version of him, maybe, I don't know, just maybe the second week of September this time, it would do wonders in terms of just making sure that you're not, multiple games behind the playoff race when the time December comes around. So 100% having Burrow healthy right now, it's been such a change of pace because the offense actually gets some quality practice in instead of having to work with the backups. And, Jake Browning, proved a little bit a couple years ago in that role. He's just not in the same stratosphere as Burrow in terms of his timing and accuracy. And when the offense as a whole gets those reps, everything looks a little bit better and more cohesive. The only question right now with this offense is who's going to start at right guard. And we can maybe talk about that a little bit. But in terms of the timing and the chemistry with the passing game right now, it's looking like everything's picking up where they left off last year, which is obviously, the most high-powered passing offense in the game.
Exactly. One of the scariest offenses in the NFL when they're all healthy. And Roger Goodell must be really looking to have the Bengals start off with a win, scheduled at Cleveland week 1 with one of their 7 quarterbacks. Will probably be starting that game. So I'm pretty confident that the Bengals will perform pretty well, but we'll knock on wood just to make sure. I'm kind of looking at, how about this? You mentioned the offensive line. Tell me how that's going to be different this year, because it's something that, like, the offense always performs well, but when I look at the Pro Football Focus or the really smart, nerdy, grades for offensive linemen, it feels like the Cincinnati O-line is always just kind of in the middle of the pack.
Middle of the pack is generous. I think they've been pretty clearly below average at best throughout the majority of his career. Even in 2021, like, that was one of the worst offensive lines that he's ever had. And obviously that was the year they went to the Super Bowl. He got sacked 9 times in the playoff game and 1 on the road against the 1 seed. It's unheard of, right? So he's been able to do so much with such little protection in front of him. And I think that's like the biggest reason as to why he deserves the credit that he gets, even if he has these superstar wide receivers. But enough of that soapbox. With this offensive line, this current iteration, they got 2 basically skyscrapers to tackle in Orlando Brown Jr. and Amarius Mims, who do a great job of sustaining power, just pushing guys to the outside, allowing Burrow to step up. But the problem with last year is that they had the worst starting guard duo in the league. If not the worst, one of the absolute worst. Alex Kappa was dealing with an injury that he suffered the year prior. He just wasn't the same. Cordell Volson, at the end of the day, was just a day 3 pick from an FCS school in North Dakota State, and he just wasn't really cut out to be an NFL starter. You didn't get rid of both guys. Cordell Volson's still on the team, but he's not projected to start. You insert a 3rd-round pick in Dylan Fairchild at left guard, who power is his game. He's going to withstand bull rushes. He's got some speed to him as well. So I think that's a pretty clear upgrade at left guard. Even if he's a rookie starter, he's going to run through some ups and downs here and there. But I think significantly better than the starter that they had last year. But at right guard, it's still a massive question mark, and I really don't understand why they exited this offseason without solidifying that, instead of just signing a career backup journeyman in Lucas Patrick and then re-signing Cody Ford, who gave him some decent playing time last year coming off the bench. But if Cody Ford is one of your top answers to start for a Joe Burrow offensive line, it's the biggest blind spot in terms of this team's evaluation process, and they just don't value the position like they should. Everyone else in the NFL is realizing the true value of having solid, stout pass protectors up in the middle of the offensive line for your quarterback to step up and create out of structure. It's what the Bills and the Chiefs have really dug in with, as well as the Ravens, right? So having not having that as a part of your offense, it just makes Burrow's life a lot harder, and it forces him to do things and create out of structure. But I think with right guard, it's going to come down to Lucas Patrick or Cody Ford, and maybe even this rookie in Jalen Rivers, who's drafted in the 5th round, who's mostly played tackle for most of his time. So there's no real good option right now on the roster to start at right guard, but that's just been the MO for the Bengals for the past maybe 10 years or so.
I want to talk about Chase Brown. Last season, he had 1,300 yards rushing, receiving total. At least for me, kind of came out of nowhere. Zach Moss obviously deals with an injury early on in the season. Chase Brown takes over the starting job and is incredibly productive. Am I crazy to think that, like, this guy can be one of the, maybe not in like the Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry tier, Am I crazy to think that he can be looked at as like one of the better running backs in the NFL, or am I just saying that because he was on my fantasy team last year and I won a championship?
He's an interesting player. Like I think there was a lot of promise with him coming out of college because at Illinois they leaned on him as a bell cow for his senior year, and he ran mostly out of the shotgun. So I think schematically he knew what he was getting into with the Bengals, who almost run exclusively out of the shotgun. They're trying to evolve a little bit more by getting Burrow in the pistol so they can set up some play action a little bit better. But again, like schematically, I think Brown was set up for success when he got to Cincinnati, even if the offensive line in front of him wasn't too great. And as a rookie, like he didn't get a ton of opportunities behind Joe Mixon, but Mixon's biggest issue was he couldn't be able to create on his own and he couldn't generate yards after contact. And somehow Chase Brown, who is only like 5'10, about 205 pounds as a rookie, he was better at that. He was significantly better than Mixon at that. And then next year happened, and Zach Moss was again thought to be this pretty solid scheme fit for this run game that they had, but Moss suffered a broken neck in week one.
Yep.
He somehow played through it for 8 weeks, which is totally insane to me. But clearly he wasn't himself. He wasn't the Colts version of Zach Moss. And Brown, again, like he took on a bigger opportunity. And I think people were surprised at how he was able to kind of shoulder the vast majority of carries with this offense. But again, like the speed and the burst, it's so evident. And he can create, additional yardage that just wasn't there for the Bengals run game before him, even when Mixon was at his best. I think he was mostly just a product of a lot of the blocking in front of him. And unfortunately, like there was just, it was at the point where they kind of needed to look elsewhere. And I think Brown has been a really promising fit in terms of his athleticism and his ability to gain more yards than you expect. So one of the best running backs in the league. I don't know if I'd go that far yet, but I think this is a great year for him to prove and really solidify himself in basically pretty much almost that tier, I would say.
I'm gonna try and get him on my team again. That Zach Moss story was crazy.
Yeah.
That like I just heard about that like on the Ringer fantasy show. They told that story and like basically he probably got hurt in like the first week of the season, and then it's like it was kind of like just battling, because that's kind of what happens when you're the edge of the roster type guy. You kind of battle through some of those injuries. Then he actually finally ended up getting it checked out, and it's like, oh yeah, you have a broken neck, dude. like like you got to sit. You got to sit, homie. So
Football players are absolutely insane.
yeah,
I don't.
some of the toughest people alive, man. What's the latest with Trey Hendrickson right now? We are recording this August 11th for anyone else that's watching out there. What's the latest with him?
So his entire offseason, I think, has been erratic in the sense of his plan and how to get the Bengals to listen, because the Bengals do not budge in the face of players being pissed. They never have in the history of Mike Brown's ownership. And spoiler alert for people keeping track, Mike Brown is 90, and if and when his daughter like takes over full time, his daughter's not that much different. So this is just going to be the reality for the Bengals for the next forever. But Trey requested a trade last year. He's been looking to get paid a real contract. When I say real contract, I mean more than just basically pay as you go. Like have some guaranteed money, have some security for the future. He's been trying to get that really since he signed back in 2021 and realized that he was already underpaid because he had a breakout year that year when he signed with the Bengals. And he requested a trade again. He got the permission to seek a trade, and I don't know if he thought that he could get a first round pick or that was the promise made to the Bengals, but that clearly wasn't in the cards in terms of his value. So then every time there's been a report about him or someone's talking about him, he's always trying to get his side of the story out there immediately and trying to get the Bengals to move in ways that just doesn't really exist. So when he decided to not be at training camp after talks broke down again, it seemed like only a matter of time before he would come back, because I really do think that he wants to be out there. He wants to be practicing, which is why he's now doing the hold in, because he also doesn't want to be fined $50,000 for missing a day of practice. So he's doing all the right things now. I think he wants to show that he's still committed to being on this team and wants to work something out. And typically when you have that desire from both the player and the team, and I still think the team realizes that he needs to be paid more than what he has, it's just about finding that number, that middle ground for everyone. And again, like the Bengals are so slow with these, like they always undervalue their players unnecessarily, which is why they're paying T. Higgins more than they probably should when they could have signed him a couple years ago. That's why they're paying Jamar Chase a little bit more than what they should if they could have signed him last year, right? So they're going to pay Trey Hendrickson more than what they probably would want to pay him, but it's not going to happen until like they just really break him down and say, hey, like let's just meet in the middle here, let's find a number, and it's going to be again a little bit more than what they're probably comfortable with, but that's the price of getting an all-pro defensive end out there for the next couple of years.
Yeah, that's also kind of the hard part of it too, is he is getting up there in age a little bit. I think he's like, what is he, like 30 now?
Mhm.
Um, and the issue with that with the Bengals was like, hey, maybe it's going to be a little bit more pricey than what we want. But I was, reading this earlier. Last year, he had 17 and a half sacks. Am I right on that number?
Yep.
And the rest of the Bengals roster had 18 and a half. So he
That's more than
literally
I
had
actually
half.
thought.
What?
That's 18 and a half is more than I actually thought.
Yeah, that's at least what I read in this preview magazine. So basically, he's half of like the sacks of the team. So if he's not out there, like you're going to be relying on Shamar Stewart, the rookie, who I think kind of plays a. I assume they'll probably play together, but that's probably the only other pass rush type guy that you guys have on the roster. The defense last year, we mentioned it a little bit here, been kind of dancing around it. One of the worst in the NFL last year. Trey Hendrickson was the bright spot, and then there wasn't that many other bright spots with this team. Brought in Al Golden. We mentioned that earlier. What else other than just replacing the coordinator are the Bengals trying to do differently to just get this offense, back to where it was when they're, were making the playoffs and trying to get to a Super Bowl?
Al Golden has by far the most pressure on him than any defense coordinator in the NFL because no other defensive coordinator gets hired and then basically nothing about his defense changes from a personnel standpoint. Like you mentioned, Shamar Stewart was the only real pass rusher that they brought in outside of this team. And frankly, they had basically zero pass rush outside of Trey Hendrickson. Most of the sacks were just a part of the scheme and a result of the pressure that Hendrickson himself was creating. So I don't know if they have enough answers up front in terms of a pass rush. I think TJ Sladen, the nose tackle that they signed from the Green Bay Packers, he's a massive improvement over last year because they didn't have a nose tackle last year. So that really hindered the linebackers in terms of how they were able to fill their run fits. And the run defense as a whole was just terrible because they didn't replace DJ Reader. And they kind of replaced him this year, but we'll see if Sladen kind of lives up to that billing. The secondary is basically the same outside of not bringing back Von Bell, who was completely over the hill last year and starting over Jordan Battle when that shouldn't have happened in the first place. They haven't had a capable starting safety since Jesse Bates left. And I don't know if Geno Stone is going to be that guy. He's entering now a contract year, and I think there's a lot of motivation for him. But they're hoping that Golden and his scheme, which is supposed to be more simplified, because with Lou Anarumo, his whole thing was that he didn't trust young players to kind of run the advanced, pre-snap and post-snap rotations that he wanted, which worked wonders when they had personnel against the likes of Mahomes and Allen, and it's why they were able to be successful in the playoffs. But once that personnel kind of drifted off, and you didn't have the veterans who could move in space and operate at the same level, everything kind of went to poop, right? So he didn't have any trust in a lot of these draft picks that they've invested on defense. And the goal with Al Golden now is to basically utilize those draft picks like Chris Jenkins. You got, why am I blinking? Cam Taylor-Britt, DJ Turner, Josh Newton, Jordan Battle, like I just mentioned, a lot of guys on the defensive side of the ball that just haven't played as much as they should have under Lou Anarumo, and it's basically Al Golden's responsibility now to put these guys in the best position with his new scheme and see what they have in store for them. Because if the defense is as bad as it was in the past couple of years, then you're going to see massive personnel changes to that side of the ball next year.
We interviewed Brian Driscoll, who covers Notre Dame, and I asked him about Al Golden, how big of a loss that was going to be for Notre Dame, because the defense was really the big driving force of Notre Dame making it to the national championship game last year. And if you follow Notre Dame just throughout the whole year, a thing that like maybe you don't really know unless you kind of looked at all of like the nuts and bolts of Notre Dame, they had a lot of injuries
Mm-hmm.
last year. So even though they would have, injuries on the defensive line, they're still able to um, have young guys come in, fit in the system. And the new DC there, Notre Dame, I believe like one of his quotes is like, "Hey, everything is like amazing here. I'm just trying to like, enhance what Al Golden built." So I definitely think Cincinnati hit a home run with the defensive coordinator hire Al Golden. And yeah, man, if he fixes the defense and has it's not crazy to have a big turnaround in the defense. Maybe we won't see it in September, maybe we won't see it in October, but maybe when we're getting close to uh playoff time, that's when you start seeing this defense round into shape and really just be a hopefully be a reason that you guys make the playoffs again, because we want to see Joe Burrow in the playoffs.
Isn't that crazy though? Like I always think back to this because the Bengals quarterbacks had never been like I was born long after Boomer Esiason, right? But he was like a Hollywood movie star almost. And the quarterbacks since, it's a better quarterback history than most people think. But like no one really like Carson Palmer didn't move anyone like that. Andy Dalton was a nice guy, but he always, just failed in the biggest moments. People love watching Joe Burrow. People love watching the Bengals because of their quarterback. And that's such a refreshing change for someone who's followed this team for 30 years now. And like to see people say like the in some cases the NFL favors the Bengals in some of these games. It's like this is another dimension that I'm living in. I'm not used to having the Bengals be treated like this and covered in this way. But yeah, like that's the reality, and that's why there's so much pressure on Golden just to basically get this defense average. By the time, like you said, the heart of the season comes around, the hope is that the offense again it doesn't start in the gutter at this point and is able to carry kind of the defense in the early part of the season, especially against some of these weaker opponents, like you mentioned the Browns in week 1, the Jaguars in week 2, while they're still figuring stuff out with them, like to be able to at least win one of those games and just get the ball rolling so you're not below 500 by the time the defense maybe finds its footing or whatever. It can set them up for a good year and the ability to make the playoffs again. And that is the expectation ultimately, because if they do miss the playoffs, then Zach Taylor is going to have some questions to answer. I don't know if he would get fired necessarily, but making the playoffs is of the highest priority right now.
Yeah, I think the schedule is I don't know where it maybe ranks on like the toughest, hardest. I don't know if it's that difficult. I don't know if it's the easiest, but I was kind of looking at it, and maybe it's just because it starts off Cleveland, Jacksonville. Maybe that's why I kind of look at the schedule like, this is pretty favorable for the Bengals, but that's going to be a big question. By the way, Joe Burrow, Iowa native, born in Ames, Iowa.
Not a lot of people know that.
Yeah,
a lot of people know that.
Yeah, he almost went to Iowa State too. A lot of people don't know that. It's very, very close, and he chose Ohio State, which is probably the right decision. John, we're running out of time here. I want to ask one last question, and then we'll get out of here. What's the deal with Skyline Chili? What is that?
As an Iowa native yourself, right? I don't expect anyone outside of Cincinnati to immediately be captivated by the idea of essentially Greek meat sauce on top of extremely cheap spaghetti, or in some cases, an extremely cheap hot dog. I know cheese conies, chili dogs, like they're not uncommon outside of Cincinnati, and for whatever reason they see a Skyline coney and are like, what the hell is that? I think it's more like the three-way, which is what I mentioned, just very cheap spaghetti with essentially just wet Greek meat sauce. Like they call it chili, but it's not actually chili. It's not the Texas chili that you're thinking of, and it's actually quite delectable. It may take you a little bit back the first time you eat it. You're like, I'm not sure what this is, and I think that kind of triggers like a little bit of fear in there. But you top it off with some mild cheddar cheese, especially when you got a couple drinks in you. It's 2 a.m. It is phenomenal. And I've been eating it for my entire life, so I love it. And I don't trust people from Cincinnati who don't love it. But if you're not from Cincinnati and you're a little bit taken aback by it, I totally understand it, because it is very odd. But it is just one of those things where you just have to try a couple of times, and you just realize, yeah, this is genius. There's no wonder it's been 70 years people are still eating this.
Incredible. The thing apparently in Iowa, I don't know anyone that's ever done this, but the thing in Iowa is like you have chili with like cinnamon rolls. That's apparently an Iowa thing, but I've never met anyone that ever does that. So I think it's maybe just a myth.
There is cinnamon and chocolate, just little hints of it in the actual Skyline chili, which I think it creates like a little sweetness in it to it. But again, it's not like any chili that you or probably anyone that you know has ever eaten, but somehow, some way, it works.
I'll have to try it sometime if I've ever went in Rome or went in Cincinnati. John, we're running out of time here. Do you want to tell us where we can find all of your content and follow all of your work, and then we'll head out of here?
Absolutely, James. Thanks for having me on again. You can find my work at a2zsports.com, covering the Bengals there. And then you can also find some video content at the A to Z Sports Cincinnati YouTube channel. And like James, who did his research before this program, the #1 Bengals podcast on YouTube and the Believe Podcast Network, where you can catch me and Daddy-O McDuck and Dr. Hoji, the electric smoji, covering the Bengals in a way that I promise you've never seen before.
Yeah, we'll leave the link for that YouTube channel in the description below. So if you haven't already checked it out, make sure you check it out. Very, very entertaining watch. And you definitely learn something when you watch it. It's not, I watch a lot of podcasts because we have a lot of people on, and I was very impressed by this one. So John, thank you very much for coming on. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure you hit like, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you for watching.